What if the reason you'd rather spend Friday night alone isn't who you are, it's who you had to become? Most people treat "I just like being alone" as a personality trait, the same way they describe liking coffee or hating small talk. It gets filed away as simple preference, no different from any other taste. But for a lot of people, solitude isn't a preference they arrived at casually. It's a system they built, one closed door at a time, usually before they were old enough to understand why they were building it. Nobody sits a child down and teaches them to prefer being alone. It happens quietly, through repetition, through 100 small moments where being around people cost more than it gave back, and being alone gave something back that people couldn't. By the time you're an adult, it doesn't feel like a strategy anymore. It just feels like you. And that is where the real question begins. Is your solitude something you are choosing right now, or something you are defaulting to automatically? Those two can look almost identical from the outside. Both can look like a closed door, an unanswered message, a quiet Friday night, or a person who says, "I just need time alone." But from the inside, they are not the same. One feels like freedom. The other feels like a reflex that moves before you even get a chance to decide. In this video, we're looking at 6 hidden patterns that quietly train a person to feel safer alone than surrounded, not because they dislike people, but because of what they learned long before they had the language to explain it. See how many of these you recognize. 1. When comfort had to be self-supplied. Picture a house where nobody reliably came when you cried, not out of cruelty, necessarily, just distraction, exhaustion, or a parent who was managing their own storm and had nothing left over. You'd fall, or get hurt, or feel overwhelmed, and the response was inconsistent at best, absent at worst. Sometimes someone showed up. Sometimes you waited and nobody did, and you learned to stop waiting before the wait even finished. So your brain did what brains are built to do when a system isn't working. It found a workaround. If comfort wasn't reliably coming from outside, you'd have to learn to generate it yourself. You figured out how to slow your own breathing, talk yourself down mid-panic, sit with a feeling until it passed on its own instead of hoping someone would help it pass faster. By adulthood, this shows up as someone who almost never asks for help, not because you don't need it, but because some early version of you concluded that asking rarely worked, so it quietly stopped being an option worth trying in the first place. You became fluent in handling things privately, and fluency, once built, doesn't easily unlearn itself. Even now, there's probably a small, automatic flinch that happens right before you'd have to ask someone for support, a flinch that has nothing to do with the person in front of you, and everything to do with someone who wasn't there a long time ago. Solitude, in this case, isn't about avoiding people. It's the place where you first learned that you could actually be relied on, even if that person was only you. 2. When being too much got a reaction. Some children learn that silence isn't safety. It's the exact opposite of danger, which is a different thing entirely. Loud emotions got a room quiet in ways that felt heavier than any punishment. A big reaction, a strong opinion, an inconvenient need voiced at the wrong moment, and suddenly the temperature in the house dropped a few degrees and stayed there for a while. Nobody has to say "don't feel that" out loud for a child to learn the rule. A sigh is enough. A change in tone is enough. A door that closes a little harder than usual is enough. Children are excellent pattern detectors long before they're good at anything else, and this is a pattern they detect fast. Neutral was safe. Wanting things, needing things, reacting to things, that came with a cost that wasn't worth paying more than once or twice. So you adjusted your own volume down, gradually, without ever deciding to. The adult version of this is a person who has an unusually high tolerance for discomfort before they'll say anything is wrong, and an unusually low tolerance for group settings where big emotions are expected or performed. Groups feel loud not necessarily because of the actual noise in the room, but because of the internal noise it takes to manage yourself inside it, to keep your own volume at the setting you learned was acceptable. Alone, there's nothing to turn down, nothing to monitor. It's the one setting where your own volume is finally allowed to be whatever it actually is, without an audience deciding whether that's too much. 3. When independence was handed to you before you asked for it. There's a difference between choosing to be self-sufficient and having self-sufficiency handed to you because nobody else was going to hold that role. Maybe you were the oldest sibling. Maybe a parent was absent, sick, or simply not built for the job that particular season of life required of them. Either way, You ended up solving problems that were, by any fair measure, too big for the age you were at the time you were solving them. You learned to make decisions without asking, because asking usually meant a delay, or a wrong answer, or no answer at all. You learned that waiting for backup meant, more often than not, that nothing came. So eventually you stopped waiting and started just handling it, whatever it happened to be that week. This tends to look like strength from the outside, and often it genuinely is, but underneath it, there's usually a quieter discomfort most people never see. The sense that needing someone is a kind of exposure you'd rather not risk if you can help it. Being around people who expect to be leaned on can feel oddly heavier than being completely on your own, because leaning on someone requires believing they'll actually hold the weight without dropping it. That belief takes time, and evidence most people in this pattern were simply never given the chance to build, so the belief never fully formed. Instead, a different belief formed in its place, that competence and connection were somehow in competition with each other, and that choosing one meant quietly giving up the other. 4. When your nervous system learned to expect too much, too fast. Not every child grows up around obvious chaos. Sometimes it's subtler than that, and harder to name later. Tension that never quite resolved. Adults who loved each other but argued in a way that left the air feeling charged for hours afterward, even after the actual argument had ended. A house that was never dangerous, exactly, but never fully calm either. So calm itself started to feel like something you couldn't quite trust. A nervous system raised inside that kind of low-grade unpredictability doesn't get to relax the way a calmer one does. It stays a little more alert, a little more scanning, even in rooms where nothing is actually wrong. Reading a room for shifts in tone becomes second nature, almost automatic, because once, a long time ago, that kind of reading mattered enormously to your safety. As an adult, this shows up as exhaustion after ordinary social situations, not because the people involved were difficult, but because your system was doing background work the entire time, tracking energy and tone almost without your permission, the way it was trained to. Solitude, for a nervous system built this way, isn't antisocial. It's the only setting where the scanning finally gets permission to stop. 5. When you were the one who noticed everything first. Some people are simply wired to take in more tone, more subtext, more of what's happening underneath a conversation than what's actually being said out loud in it. As a child, this kind of sensitivity has nowhere useful to go. Nobody sits down and teaches an 8-year-old how to process picking up on their parents' unspoken tension at the dinner table. So the feelings just accumulate, unsorted, with no outlet built for them. The workaround, again, was withdrawal, not from people entirely, but from prolonged exposure to them. Stepping outside for air after too long indoors. Going quiet in the back of a classroom while everyone else stayed loud. Needing a door closed after a busy day in a way other kids in the same house didn't seem to need, which made it feel like something was wrong with you rather than something you'd simply have to manage. This carries forward as an adult who isn't avoiding connection, exactly, but who has a noticeably shorter runway for it than other people seem to have. Not because the connection isn't wanted or the people aren't valued, because taking in that much information, that constantly, has a cost that most people around you never had to learn to budget for, so they don't always understand why you need to leave the room they're still enjoying. You've probably been called overly sensitive, or told you're overthinking something that felt obvious to you and invisible to everyone else. Both of those labels miss the actual mechanism. They describe the symptom without ever asking what the symptom was protecting you from in the first place. 6. When solitude became the only place nothing was required of you. This last one ties the others together. In most of these childhoods, being around people wasn't neutral, it came with a job attached. Manage someone's mood. Read the room before it turned. Perform calm you didn't feel. Be smaller, quieter, easier than you actually were in that moment. Alone, none of that was required. Nobody needed managing. Nothing needed reading. You could simply exist without a task attached to existing. That absence of demand is a kind of relief most people who grew up in calmer households never had reason to notice, because they never had to earn the absence of a job in the first place. As an adult, this is often the real reason solitude feels like relief rather than isolation. It's not that people are unpleasant. It's that being around them, for you, has historically come bundled with responsibilities nobody assigned out loud, but that you absorbed anyway. Alone is simply the one place the bundle gets set down. If one of these 6 patterns already sounds like your own childhood, comment the number that hit closest to home. I want to know which one you recognized first. Put these 6 together: self-supplied comfort, a volume turned down early, independence that arrived too soon, a nervous system trained to scan, a sensitivity with nowhere to unload, and a room where nothing was ever required of you. And a different picture starts to form. None of these are really about disliking people. All of them are about a mind that, at some point, decided being alone was the more predictable, less demanding option, and never fully reconsidered that decision once it had already worked. And now we return to the question from the beginning. Is your solitude something you're choosing right now, or something you're defaulting to automatically? Those aren't the same thing, even though they can feel identical from the inside. Choosing solitude feels settled. You could be around people, and you're opting out anyway, on purpose, because it's genuinely what you want in this moment. Defaulting to it feels different once you look closely. It's less a decision and more a reflex, one that fires before you've actually weighed the option of staying in the room a little longer. The goal here isn't to talk yourself into being more social, or to treat solitude like a problem waiting to be corrected. For a lot of people, alone time genuinely is where the mind gets quiet enough to think clearly, where nothing needs to be managed or performed for anyone else's benefit. That part of it doesn't need defending, and nobody should try to talk you out of needing it. The goal is just to notice which one is actually running the moment, the choice, or the reflex underneath it, quietly making the decision for you before you've had a chance to make it yourself. Because once you can tell the difference between the two, you get something you didn't have before: the ability to stay in a room a little longer when you want to, not because you have to prove anything to anyone, but because you're finally choosing it instead of retreating from it automatically, out of habit, the way you were trained to a long time ago. You didn't end up here because something is wrong with you. A younger version of you found the safest option available at the time, with the tools that were actually on hand, and it worked well enough that it quietly became the default setting for everything after. That's not a flaw to be corrected. That's simply what a mind does when it's trying to protect itself with whatever it has. The only question worth asking now is whether the setting still fits the life you actually have today, or whether it's time to see what happens when you leave the door open a little longer than usual, just to find out. If this video put words to something you've been carrying quietly, subscribe to this channel for more videos on hidden psychology, self-awareness, and the parts of your mind still waiting to be understood.